Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 2nd, 2022. I want to thank all of you who sent me emails regarding your thoughts on the 10 fundamental principles drafted by Helga Zepp LaRouche. I wanted to go into a discussion of a lot of this today, but unfortunately, I'm suffering from a bit of a cold, and also I was up very late last night writing an article. So I didn't have time to get through all of the emails and responses to them. But I'm going to group the questions that came out into two basic points that I'll address in the discussion today. One is sovereignty a universal principle? And related to that is the assertion that you can't have sovereign states because man is inherently not good, is inherently evil. Now, let's begin with the belief that man is inherently evil. That's a devastating philosophical premise. If you believe that, then it's almost impossible to live in a world with almost 8 billion people. The idea that one man can be an island and the only way to be true is to be true to thyself ignores the fact that there is a human race of many, many people who have a lot of common interests. And among those interests are those of freedom, the freedoms that we enjoy, the right to make a living, the right to have a future for your children and grandchildren. And these are freedoms which states do not have the right to take away. But unless they're fought for and protected as principles, then they won't survive. Now, if you believe that all men is evil, then you're essentially adopting the premise of the World Economic Forum and the Davos crowd, the British Empire, and oligarchies and eugenicists, that only a few are decent and good and should have the power to rule and should have the right to cull the herd, to get rid of the useless eaters. And in fact, that is an outlook which we find very prevalent in the world today, and especially among leading oligarchs, such as King Charles and his father, the late Prince Philip. And if you believe that, then you believe that certain people or groups have a right to police the planet and to use coercive measures to keep the peace and control the population through use of narratives, better known as brainwashing, and also the assertion of state power, which functions in the form of a security state, as we've seen since the adoption of the Patriot Act and censorship. These violate the principles of our Constitution. And I think it's worth to restate what Helga Zepp LaRouche included in her 10 fundamental principles for achieving a new security and financial architecture, because she reflects the optimism of Friedrich Schiller, who is profoundly influenced by the American Revolution and the American Constitution. And she states that explicitly in the fourth principle, where she says, quote, "The true nature of man is to become a beautiful soul," unquote. And again, she reiterates that in the 10th principle, which states, quote, "The basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome." Now, if you believe that man is by nature evil, you stand with the British philosopher, so-called Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan puts forward the idea of a social contract in which an absolute sovereignty is vested in the power of a powerful man, a monarch, an emperor, or someone of that sort, who has the right to rule by force. Or John Locke's slightly more clever and sophistical version of a social contract. Now, Locke's social contract is often attributed to the ideas of the shaping the founding of our country, of the United States. But in fact, it's not. Locke was rejected by the American founders. Locke himself was an investor in the Royal Africa Society, the slave society, and was very instrumental in the shaping of the policies of the Imperial British East India Company. Now, Locke's views and Hobbes' views were refuted by Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz is sometimes known for his statement that God created the best of all possible worlds, by which he means that man has the power to improve the conditions of all mankind. And that's a reflection of what Mrs. LaRouche stated in this comment, that there's a cohesion between the way the mind works and the laws of the physical universe, and that it's up to man through scientific and creative reason to discover those higher principles of lawfulness and apply them to improve the conditions of man. Now, the Founding Fathers and Leibniz, the Founding Fathers stood with Leibniz that government can only act with the consent of the governed, but that must be to direct its efforts to promote the general welfare, not the power of private interests, which is the idea of Locke. Locke's idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of property was debated and rejected by the Founding Fathers, who instead inserted the idea of pursuit of happiness, which was clearly stated in Leibniz's paper on society and economy, in which he spoke about people who happily go about their business, whatever that business may be. Leibniz was born in 1646, which was 2 years before the adoption of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, but actually nearly 150 years of religious warfare in Europe. And the Peace of Westphalia is based on the concept that sovereign states must act by recognizing the legitimacy of other sovereign states, of the interests of other sovereign states, which is a form of applying the golden rule of Christianity and virtually all religions to statecraft. And the idea is that you may have a different religion, in this case, Lutheranism, Protestantism, or Catholicism, yet you have to recognize that ultimately there's a common reflection of that principle of man in the image of God, which exists in virtually every religion and should be recognized as legitimate. This was established by the Peace of Westphalia, not as a balance of power, but as a principle to be pursued by all governments, especially governments of goodwill. Is it a perfect solution? Well, there are problems because you have private interests that create power in the hands of ruthless individuals. Does that prove that all human beings are evil? Well, no, it proves that some people are willing to use their power for self purposes. But that's not the basis on which a state or relations between states should be based. Now, interestingly, in 1999, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, one of the biggest war criminals of the last 2 centuries, launched a campaign to abolish the idea of the Peace of Westphalia. What Blair said is that instead you have to replace it with the idea of the right to protect. That is, that strong nations must act in the interests of other nations. And this was used as a justification for the bombing of Serbia in the 1990s Balkans War. It was used as the basis for justifying the invasion of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of destruction of Libya, and so on. This idea that might makes right is literally what Blair was asserting outside of or to get rid of the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. Now, what we're seeing is an invigoration of this idea of sovereignty in precisely the form that the Founding Fathers of the United States believed it to exist. That is, that nations do have a right to pursue their own interests, and in doing so, can find common purpose with other nations. This was inherent in John Quincy Adams' statement that we do not go abroad to seek monsters to fight, but instead work for common purpose. This is the idea of the BRICS. This is the idea that goes back to the founding of the non-aligned movement with the 1957 Bandung Conference, and which has recently been reasserted by a series of events that just took place in Indonesia, which was one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement. This is the principle which underlies Helga Zepp LaRouche's 10 fundamental principles, which is that nations can find common purpose, not through bombs and deployment of military and the assertions that our side is right, but through dialogue, through negotiations. And this is precisely what's been rejected for years now by the West in addressing the legitimate security concerns raised by Vladimir Putin for Russia. So the question of sovereignty is an absolute right for nations. It doesn't give them the right to attack other nations, but it does establish a principle on which true diplomacy must be based. An example of this was the reaction from the South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, to U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, excuse me, when Blinken went to South Africa to try to twist their arms to endorse the sanctions against Russia. And Foreign Secretary Pandor said to Blinken, Mr. Secretary, we are a sovereign state. You can't come here and bully us. And that's the outlook now which is being expressed in this new emergence of the global South. And it's something which must be taken into consideration by Western nations, the former colonial powers, who are used to functioning as a leviathan in Hobbes's idea that the world is a jungle and the powerful interests have the right to control it. Think of what Josep Borrell, the so-called foreign minister of the European Union, said about Europe as a paradise being threatened by the people from the jungle from the outside. That's the same idea. That's the Hitler idea of eugenics, that some people are better than others and therefore have a right to rule. That's been rejected by history, but it still is there in the minds of leaders of the NATO powers who think they can enforce on the world a new order, a new financial order, which benefits the powerful and the few. There's a global rebellion against this. And the idea of these 10 fundamental principles as the cornerstone of a new financial and strategic architecture was put out there by Helga Zepp LaRouche as a challenge, not to adopt them word by word, but to use them as the basis for discussion. And this idea that some people have that this is a new world order, well, there's going to be some kind of order in the world. The question is, will it be an order dominated by oligarchs and despots, or will it be based on sovereign nation states acting in cooperation with other sovereign nation states, each reflecting the interests, the legitimate interests of the other? And that's the real issue that's behind what's going on in Ukraine today. We cannot allow the fact that evil people have, in many times in history, been able to have their way as an excuse to say you can't do anything, or that's just the nature of the world, or don't worry about it, all people are evil, just take care of yourselves. That's not acceptable. And it's really incumbent on all of us to think about what we can do to strengthen that sense in others of the goodness of all human beings. Now, I just want to end by saying I'll be putting again the link to Helga Zepp's 10 fundamental principles at the bottom of the description page. And I'll also put again the link to my blog page where you'll have access to my new article that will be out by the weekend. And also you can sign up for regular notifications. Sign up for free for regular notifications to my daily update, which you can then circulate and share with others so we can build a community of principle around these ideas. So thanks for joining me this week. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.